So I have really wandered into this conference from a very different intellectual space, if not to say an intellectual planet. And I think the first thing I'll do is marginalize myself a little, and then I'm hoping that in discussion afterwards, Chris can make something out of that marginality. So I'm a faculty member, tenured member of the Harvard History Department, as well as the faculty director of the Schlesinger Library. So that's somewhat anomalous in the gathering here today, that I speak really first as a scholar. The second thing that's anomalous is I'm a faculty member from a discipline that has either been implicitly or explicitly mostly left to the side of these discussions. In other words, STEM and the professional schools are the model for most of what we're talking about. They've given us many of the models for talking about those things. I would call myself a humanist. Harvard calls me a social scientist, but I'm on the extreme humanistic end of the stick. And then the third way, I guess, related to the second piece of marginality is I'm going to talk about the very smallest possible data, which really is one. And to speak first from my own research, and then about ways that that research has chimed with my work at Schlesinger, and then finally think just a little bit, and with Chris, about what we might do with tiny data in the era of big data, with what I think of as a scholar who has worked on art and on literature as handedness, the things that are still touched. So this is not our century. This is the family picture that John Singleton Copley drew of himself and his rather dour father-in-law, and his beloved children when he got to England in the spring of 1776. I like this chain of hands as I'm talking about handedness that runs down the center of the picture. I think it's a kind of declaration of interdependence of these family members at the time of American independence. So I've just finished a biography of Copley called A Revolution in Color. I resisted the less than admirable impulse to give you a photograph of my book cover, but I'm gonna talk first about an insight that came out of that research. So Copley said in his letters of this period that the family was at the center of his life, and had, in the fashion of 18th century people, a quite sentimental marriage. This meant that his wife was very dedicated to saving his letters and not he hers, which is often the case. The daughter, the eldest daughter, Elizabeth Clark Copley, known as Betsy, is at the center of this picture. I want you to keep your eyes on the daughter. So this is Betsy here, and this is young Mary over on the right of the picture. They become very important in this story. You, of course, can't really tell who's male and who's female in this picture because this is before the moment when 18th century people were breeched. So that's Betsy in a later picture as the still recognizable but rather horse-faced young woman that she became. And the second portrait, the large portrait, is done when she marries back to the United States after living most of her life, really all of her life in England, the first several years in British Boston, and then her girlhood and young adulthood in London, comes back to Boston. Memorial picture is created of her, and important for our story today, her remarriage, her marriage back to Boston opens a correspondence, as great separations always do, and a chain of both affect and money that remains important to Copley's life. She's the saver first of him. She rescues him from penury by marrying an extremely rich Boston merchant named Gardner Green, whose money comes from slavery. It's a sort of slavery story from cradle to grave. And she rescues the family from obscurity by being, as daughters often are, the custodian of letters. This is the tiny sister Mary, who was on the lap in the first picture I showed you. And it's really the letters between those sisters, and you can see in the archive that survives the way that they have annotated and identified relationships across the family, in a correspondence that lasted nearly 60 years after Betsy Copley's marriage at the age of 30. These were very long-lived people. They all lived into the American Civil War, which they called the Revolution. They had called the American Revolution a civil war, which is part of my story in my book, but not this one today. They passed on this habit of memory to subsequent generations of daughters. You can see here the Aunt Mary Copley, May 1860 at the bottom. This is Betsy's daughter keeping this record. And they both lived to a very ripe old age. This is Betsy and her sort of couch-like upholstered dress and her fake bird in 1862. So they opened this enormous family archive, which came to rest at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. The distaff side went local. The women's letters were thought of as a kind of Boston rarity of Bostoniana, and the letters that they had saved from their father became part of the national patrimony and went to the Library of Congress. And it's the case that, this is the next generation, Betsy's daughter and her daughter. Betsy's daughter's daughter, the woman on the right here, Martha, given this wonderful book for keeping family memories by her mother, engraved with her name and dated from her mother. It was the case that young Martha, the grandchild, not only kept the family memory, but edited it. There's a nifty little piece of this, on the one hand, the futility of this gesture, right, crossing out a clipping from a newspaper, not a unique material, although survives in the correspondence files, the clippings files at Mass Historical Society. But this, a sense of custody that both preserves and destroys through a female line that is creating some senses of family memories and obscuring others. So how this family memory was conserved became important to my book. I turned out to be the first person to have ever read the thousands of family letters at the MHS, because the same Martha Babcock Emery, who edited her family's papers this way, also published a kind of hagiographic volume in 1882, and that's all anybody ever read thereafter. So women conserve, women obscure, and then the things that get saved as women's letters also don't get looked at. So this is stuff that I discovered in the course of my research, and I started thinking, is this a thing, the way that daughters reside in the bottom of a number of archival stories? And what lo, it is indeed a thing. Abigail Adams on the left and her daughter, also conveniently Abigail Adams, known as Nabby, on the right, in their respective portraits. Shortly before Abigail's daughter predeceases her, Abigail writes to her and says, "You alarm me when you tell me you have preserved my letters and collected them together in order to transmit them," already in 1809, so recognizably a daughter's duty that it's can be sort of described economically and conveniently this way. They must be very incorrect and quite unworthy. Do not let them outlive you. Abigail Adams's daughter ignores this, but we really don't know how fully she edited the record that she transmitted, nor have we reckoned as either historians or archivists with the ways that her agency in collecting, separating, describing the family record have been passed on to the way the Adams papers are kept also at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So yeah, it turns out to be a thing, this daughter's memories piece. And then I started talking to my colleagues at Schlesinger and discovered that, especially in a women's history archive, as ours is, there are few collections that don't have some story of a daughter at the bottom of them. So when I emailed to a group of Schlesinger archivists and curators a query tagged "donors and daughters," the first response I got back began, "Oh boy." So we have a lot of stories around the daughters who created, curated, and in some ways embroil and obscure some of our special collections. So this is the historian of science, Barbara Miller-Solomon, with her wonderful airline bag, initialed Barbara Miller-Solomon, and her daughter, Maida, who zealously protected not only third-party privacy, but fourth and fifth-party privacy. And indeed, I'm just sort of roughly sketching strands of daughterhood here. She's the daughter who could not let go, who came to the library for weeks at a time, poring over boxes of duplicates and driving the staff generally insane while they were doing their appraisal of the collection and beyond. There are daughters like Mary Lee Barringer, daughter of Linnie de Vries, shown here I think there's something wonderfully Freudian and fraught about these two photographs. So here she is as a young girl in 1938, and then later still trailing behind her mother, looking somewhat vexed in 1950. The daughter here wrote a scribal memoir of her mother's life, the personal life of Linnie de Vries, remembered and researched by her daughter, which she then closed until after her own death, because while she wanted to memorialize and document her mother, she didn't want her sisters to find out about what was included therein. So a whole legacy not only of family revelations, but family secrets, which I am unable to reveal because part of this story is these stories of transmission reside in folklore and not in any kind of archival description. Of course, not all daughters are daughters. Some of them are sons. This is the collection of known as the Papers of Marge, which comes to us through Jim's colleague in English, Larry Buell. And his brother were the conduits to that collection of Marjorie Henderson Buell, who's the creator of Little Lulu. Maybe Little Lulu here on her lap is the daughter. This actually turns out to be Larry in the picture above on the wall. And of course, Dan Hazen himself was one of these fictive daughters, steering the papers of his great aunt, Presbyterian missionary May Chapin, our way, a really important and valuable collection. But I think the particular biographies of these sons, one of them an eminent literary scholar and the other an archivist, may make them exceptions that, if they don't prove, at least gesture towards a rule about gender and custody of family memory. So what to do with this pattern besides noting it? I would argue as a scholar that we need to pay attention, we the historians and cognate disciplines, to these dynamics because they shape the ways that we know our subjects as well as what it's possible to know about them. So here is the eminent, really foundational second wave woman's historian Gerda Lerner and her daughter. And because of the way that Gerda transmitted her personal papers to us through the daughter, her professional life, Lerner's professional life, is now open and very well known, and her family life, still in custody of the female progeny, is closed and restricted to researchers. So we will continue for a generation to know Gerda Lerner as a professional without family, which has a lot of implication for the ways that historians do their work and think about the professions of, in this case, women's historians. And for librarians and archivists, I think curators certainly need to take note of these dynamics as we think about the ways to work within and around and through the intense mother-daughter bound that has these implications. And also as we think about the particular risks that might attend figures whom we want to collect who are daughterless. So for a women's history library like ours, those biases become structural. Unmarried women present certain kinds of collection challenges and risks of loss. Lesbians before equal marriage made children in lesbian families normative. Just some of the populations that may be archivally endangered by their daughterlessness. Because there won't always be the living memory of a brilliant archival processor to say, oh boy, when someone asks how a collection has come to be, we will be stuck, as generations of scholars were with Copley, seeing him half darkly through some forgotten daughter's eyes without quite knowing why the picture wasn't coming clear unless we attend to these dynamics. Thanks.
So that was terrific, really. And I have a lot of thoughts. They're slightly scattered. We'll see if they can create a trail. So make something out of marginality. That's sort of the story of my life. So let's see if I can do that. And I'm going to do it through a story. What the heck? Because it's what came up to me. So don't tweet this. And Tom, forgive me. So Marvin Minsky, the father of AI, a prominent MIT faculty member, we're talking to his daughter, Margaret Minsky, about his collection. Margaret is herself a phenomenal scholar whose PhD thesis is in DSpace, by the way, available openly, on computational haptics. So somehow there's a weaving through here of the theme of the daughters and the theme of hands and touching things. And of course at MIT our motto is mens et manos, so mind and hand. So we think about these things a lot. And I think all of us thinking about the haptic experience and the physical experience of interacting with information and knowledge and creating new knowledge, I think that came through really loud and clear in some of what you were saying. And I think because as the humanist here, one of the only humanists here, it has been missing a little bit from the conversations here. I'll also say I'm not a humanist. I'm working, but I work at a place that's a very STEM kind of place, and I've said this before. I often find myself in meetings at MIT thinking in my head, wow, I'm the only humanist in the room. And then I remember I'm actually not a human, I'm a sociologist. I mean, but it's this, you know. Something like that. So, you know, I think this notion of thinking about what does it mean that our archives come through in a gendered way, and there's gendered trail through how they come to us, and is really important. And I guess to get to another sort of hobby horse of mine, I think we have to get intersectional about talking about this, right? Because it's not just our archives, it's also the librarians and the archivists who process them and bring them in. We are predominantly a profession of white women. Not just women, not just daughters, but white women. And I think we have to think really hard about how that matters and in what ways that leaves gaps, actually, in the data. Because you talk about little data, we're at MIT very much interested in thinking about our collections as big data, as really big data. But big data is made up of bits and bytes and of little data. And as a sociologist, I care deeply about whether the data that we're looking at and examining and trying to extract truths and theories out of is comprehensive or not. And if it's not comprehensive, is it not comprehensive in some biased way? And I think that's what we have to think about each data point if we're going to think about that. So I think there's a lot to take to bring back to the beginning of the conversation as well from what you had to say, and I'd love to open it up and hear what others have to say. And I hope that made some kind of sense. You can tweet again, sorry, yes. Yeah, it was just the Minsky stuff. So yes, please tweet, but really just ask your question or comment, so.
My name is Susan Klein from UMass Dartmouth, and I'd like to open it much wider in terms of language and how it forms not only the culture we're in, but the culture that's produced for us, from which we make our selections. And so looking at the production of research, the distribution of research, the editing of research, who selects, and how it's promoted, is larger than gender. It's intercultural. And I think that that's the most troubling, is the fact that the structure of knowledge is biased. And that we have to work very hard, not only as users and distributors, but also as creators and working as publishers, which touches upon all of the presentations that have been made today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I don't have a response except to say amen. And the more different places that we can make ourselves cognizant of it, I think the better we'll do, not just of filling the gaps, but understanding the gaps, seeing the unseen, right?
Susan Gibbons at Yale. Following that question, mine is so much more mundane, but I'm curious if you saw if that same pattern exists for the archives, daughters preserving the archives of fathers, or is there something unique in the relationship of daughters to mothers of wanting to really preserve the accomplishments of the mothers that changes it?
It's a really interesting question, and I'm arguing, of course, mostly from what's not there, right? So that I would say the papers of men, personal papers of men that I've worked with have not been seen to require the level of family description and family curation because their importance is self-evident, or are not collected by places where, so if the family has not done that work in their penciled marginalia, as Betsy Copley did for the distaff side, and they're not collected by places that want to embed male figures in a family context, then that's lost. It would not be untrue to my understanding of Anglo-Americans in the 18th and 19th century that they would remove the evidence of needing to do that for a male figure just because it would work against his importance to have to identify and embed him in this way. So I think you're pointing towards something that I hadn't really thought about, that for women's collections, the work is elevating and sort of it's a kind of, especially for these Atlantic families who are separated by great distance of space and time, and then a nationhood that arises, in this case, against their will. It's a kind of we are here, that I don't see, it'd be interesting to think that an interesting counter case would be Houghton's Papers of Jared Sparks, where he goes all over the early American Republic and sort of hoovers up significant men and puts them into a collection of national founding, almost as if they just arose from the soil, which after all is still the way we tell that story, right? Hamilton might rap now, but he still stands astride history like a colossus. So I think there is something particularly energetic about Daughter's work with mothers.
I think the analogy to slave families being broken up is so telling in the distaff side staying here and the paternal side going to Elsie. Was that a conscious choice that Elsie didn't want the material, or what's the story here?
You know, those are the kinds of stories that I not only don't have access to, but I don't know a way to access, right? So that certainly for the period when these collections came, which was in the late 19th and early 20th century, there are no institutional records that would document those donor relationships. And at Schlesinger today, and maybe Tom can tell us how this is handled at Houghton, that would all live in the internal records of the Schlesinger, which wouldn't be available to researchers for a very long period of closure after such a thing happened. But I think, you know, it is not known. Just as in museums, provenance is a bare genealogical outline and pretty heavily redacted and spottily kept files back it up with textured stories of transmission. I mean, I guess, you know, as a special collections person and as a historian, a question that I have coming away from this material is how much do we care about the meta story of transmission? I think if we are serious, back to your opening comment, if we are serious about seeing the gaps, seeing the unseen, then we ought to care about transmission in ways that become, you know, that become part of a finding aid. You know, I was looking, I didn't know Dan Hazen, I was looking at the collection of his aunt, and it says that it's donated by Dan Hazen in the finding aid. That's it. There's 4 words. So how would we want to deliver that information to researchers now in an age of easy information abundance where we could do so?
Tom Hyrie. You know, this is a really interesting tension because when the history of, say, archival description or library cataloging is this just the facts approach, right? And I think that there are efficiency arguments for that, but in many ways, the way that we have approached this process is to erase our own impact on on the record itself, and that, you know, and there's a significant impact that starts from, you know, decisions about what we acquire, the stories we learn about, the materials that are in situ, those files you're talking about, which none of us allow because there are, you know, issues of confidentiality. And the question I was lining up for you was, so you're a historian and now you've come in as an administrator, you know, and there's a tension, well, I don't know if it's a tension, but those of us who are archivists have followed the discussion in academia about the archive in this kind of rarefied way, in how it's kind of almost disconnected from actual archives. Anyway, I guess I'd love to hear your reflection on that dynamic, like coming from one side sort of in through the veil in, you know, and now you're leading an organization, so.
And specifically on the tension between archives and the archive?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, that was a little rambling, but yeah, so, yeah. So, I mean, I feel like I'm going to make this worse if but, you know, but I think, you know, sometimes the archive gets talked about as this, you know, reified set of information resources that don't have real human beings behind them, or, you know, sometimes it can come.
Yes, I think these are the first named individuals who are parts of collections rather than collectors, processors, and thinkers that have been talked about today, right? I mean, that's how reified it is. It's out there as an object of study, but not the process of people. I guess, so I like through the veil, I've used the metaphor of having jumped the desk, you know, all those places that everyone, the research services people would say, stop there. Now I go behind there. And have for the first time in my career a sense of what the workflows really are that deliver a collection to me. And I guess wonder from my more customary side of the desk, what else could you, given all you do, what else could you do to make some of these answers manifest? Which I think would help us to think about who historical actors are in the fullness of their lives. So should we be doing video interviews or some kinds of light oral history with everybody who brings us a collection? And asking questions that I think we don't, we ask questions, we ask appraisal type questions. How big is it? How bigly is it? What's it going to cost us in processing time and in price, if there is a price? How are the materials truly unique? I don't think we ask routinely these meta questions of how did this come to be? Oh, your mother kept it. Well, who kept it? Who'd she get it from? So I wonder, without adding greatly to our work, and one of the things that I see working with a colleague of the excellence of Marilyn Dunn and the staff that she has built and continues to build at the Schlesinger is that everybody's highly, highly skilled and very busy. But is there some template way that we could recover these, that we could take advantage of the ego that brings people to want to give their unique materials to a library in perpetuity and offer something to some researcher in the future. I'm like the Haley Joel Osment character in Sixth Sense. I see dead people, so it's very easy for me to think back about what I want in the 18th century and make believe that it would work in the 21st. But even if we couldn't deliver it for 50 years, it would still be nice to have it.
Tom Roscoe from MIT. So that's interesting, and I think some of the complexity, one of the issues that is important, I think, when we talk about archives, and especially personal archives, and the new community archives and things like that, it's trust. Mm-hmm. Trust is such a key element to what we as archivists do in that negotiation process. And indeed, some people want to give us their stuff, and they want to, they have this sort of curatorial part to them about their possessiveness of their father, their mother, whomever it might be, and they really want to explain that. Others, it takes some effort to build that trust and to coax and tell them why this stuff is valuable. No, there is historical value. You have to convince them, and they don't see it. They don't really want to do it, and this is over weeks, days, months, years that this happens. So it is a challenging aspect to what we do, and it's and sometimes it's a lot easier than others. So I take your point, and I think it's interesting we can share more of that, and we have a lot of in our control files, as we call them, the background file. We have that information and could do more to share that, because indeed, when you talk about an archive, it's a lot of what you decided to take, not take, and there's stories behind that can help researchers understand. But it's a challenging thing to navigate.
Bridget Reicher from the law school. I was thinking of a question on a personal basis. I have, my stepfather is an emeritus professor at MIT, and he's an astrophysicist, and he has been doing most of his scientific correspondence, and including some of the personal stuff, in email. And my parents are now in their late 80s, and I'm going to have to empty their house one day. And as the daughter, the librarian daughter, I'm looking at this thinking, what do we do? And then how do we handle all that email correspondence?
Let's talk.
Okay, we will.
We can deal with that.
Yeah, we do that too. We do that too. Yeah. Almost everything comes in with email now. And sometimes in hard disks that also contain Social Security numbers and bank records and things that must be purged, because that's not a kind of completeness that that any researcher would be after or should be after, except for Julian Assange, maybe.
Well, and we have one more thing, which is that I think he has every single check he's ever written. I mean, starting in 1947. So probably MIT wants those too.
We would want a shredder for those.
No comment.
I have a question. So can you reflect actually for a moment about what Lorcan talked about in his presentation, the workflow is the collection, and the way that this kind of fits or not into this kind of statement?
I think I would have to ask Lorcan for clarification of that, because I have to confess that I think it says in my notes, workflow is a collection. What does this mean?
Well, but, I guess maybe I can say something, because this is interesting. Lorcan can follow up. Well, basically, I guess what I'm interested is, are you thinking that the workflow itself is, and I think this is what I'm hearing, is framed in a certain way? And if it is, then what do we do about that workflow? And also, how do we break that workflow? Mm-hmm. So the workflow maybe is the collection. It just means, what do we actively do about it? And so what is the stand that we should take about this?
Okay, so I think both the workflow that goes from moment of acquisition to moment of delivery and the paths of dispersal are framed by a set of habits that we have not fully theorized. At least that historians have not fully theorized, and I'm still learning about the journals you read and the ways that you theorize your material. And one of the magical things about going through the veil, as Tom said, so much more 19th century than 18th century, but okay, is that I can now think in the present and for the future about what I would have wanted to have had happen, if that's even a tense. What is that, like past, future, past perfect? What I would have wanted to have happened in the past, and think about how to make those things happen. So, I don't know, I mean, the special collections people here, how much do you ask about how things came to be, beyond making sure that the person who is delivering copyright has the right to what they're delivering, or that the dealer has fairly acquired something? I mean, I think around privacy and institutional self-protection, we do that meta-collecting work. But since part of the discussion of the last day and a half has been a sort of listening to everybody try to figure out what the black box of scholars' needs is. So this is part of the black box of my needs. If I imagine myself in 2200, I would love to have had this happen at the kinds of archives I would look at. And it's, I guess, maybe less automated, more, it's not unique to personal papers, but maybe more fraught there in the ways that, that Megan was saying.
And I guess I'll just add, I mean, I hope we can think about this and thinking about the workflow and thinking about characterizing the kinds of collections you're talking about as little data. Well, we certainly are seeing a lot of attention paid to other kinds of data and trying to understand where it came from and sharing it openly and how it was conceived. And, you know, you think about the replication crisis in psychology, and, you know, that's all about trying to go back and see, how was this data created, and, you know, what does it mean, and is it trustworthy, and, you know, and I think we owe it to the rest of, you know, other kinds of scholarship to...
The ones whose journals cost $55 a year.